Good afternoon, everyone. As they slowly open the doors for you all to come and join us in our Australia at Home virtual trades hall for a very special political Geekfest. Today I don't think we're launching because books have 100 launches.
No,
and it's an essay anyway. But we're here to talk about Katharine's quarterly essay, which was launched or released yesterday in the bookshops. And that's very exciting. Hi, Katharine. Congratulations and
thank you.
Mazel tov.
Yeah. Oh, yes, thank you, thank God, etc. Yes, no, thank you for that.
Let's get cracking. Before we start, pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land I'm on, which are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I join all of you wherever you are around Australia, paying your respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognising the land we were all on was never ceded. Welcome. Lots of familiar faces. You guys know how this works. If you're new, turn on the chat, turn on your screens, ask questions, introduce yourself to each other and sit back and enjoy an hour of relaxed, inclusive, respectful conversation based around Katharine's essay, which is really a profile in progress. It was a work that you were commissioned to write about our glorious Prime Minister. I suspect it was commissioned before the pandemic really hit. And then you had a chance to build a thesis about the Prime Minister, which is what essays are all about, over the course of this remarkable year. So you want to talk a little bit first about the pitch for the essay and the journey you went on in building this thesis, and I guess how it changed apart from the obvious along the way, Katharine.
Yeah, well, thank you. When I was first commissioned to write this essay, it was intended to be just a straight quarterly essay style profile of a Prime Minister. And I was quite excited about doing that because Morrison is sort of not very well studied. But then COVID came along and obviously major story, both domestically and internationally. The commission sort of drifted into being a blend of the event, this incredible event, and capturing the Prime Minister in the midst of managing a major event. And then we would try and form some conclusions about him through the lens of how he was managing this particular event. It was important, I thought, to do both things. I genuinely wanted to record the history of the opening few months of the pandemic in Australia because a lot of really interesting and important things happened over those months. Lots of practical things, but also at the level at which I'm deeply interested in politics and public life, which was at the trust level. We witnessed this sort of display of competence by the governments of Australia, and also a brief truce in hyperpartisanship and tribalism. And that theme is sort of explored in the essay through the accounts of the central protagonists. There's sort of lovely kind of bits and pieces in the essay where Christian Porter narrates his relationship with Sally McManus and Sally McManus with Christian Porter. Porter also narrates the process of bringing Greg Combay into the centre of that early decision-making as a consultant on labour market matters, but then also more broadly. And it's not only those relationships, it's kind of across the board. So I just thought there was a really interesting history there to capture and draw some conclusions about, but then also tracking back to Morrison and the reason for the commission and the fact that he is very unstudied. Part of the reason that he is very unstudied is he's very difficult to get a handle on. He is a really difficult figure to profile, not because the sort of, elements of his biography are hard to track down, or not because of that, but because I think I said in a column a couple of weekends ago that he's like a stealth fighter. He's kind of purpose-built to avoid detection. He has this strange reflective quality that is hard to capture. I think he's sort of quantifiably different to, I think, every other Prime Minister that I've covered in my reporting lifetime, and that my reporting lifetime started with the final 2 weeks of Paul Keating before that election, spans John Howard and through to the present. All of Morrison's predecessors as Prime Minister came to the job with clearly defined values and wish lists about what they wanted to achieve in public life. Obviously, Prime Ministers grow in the job and they develop a broader range of policy interests, and they do more things perhaps than they intended at the beginning. But with all of Morrison's predecessors, I could, in a little thought experiment I did, identify a hill that all of those people would die on, like something that is so important to them as political figures and as custodians of their political movements. The values were easy to identify. In Scott Morrison's case, he is a much more protean figure. I can't identify a hill on which Scott Morrison would die as a Prime Minister. Perhaps over the span of his Prime Ministership, we'll all identify one together, but I certainly couldn't do it conceptually. And the reason for that is he is this sort of hybrid as a Prime Minister between a campaign director, so a project manager, a fixer, a problem solver. He's not in public life. He doesn't sort of speak rhapsodically about reform. He doesn't speak rhapsodically about the values of the Liberal Party that as a flame he must keep. He's a populist. He thinks that governing after the global financial crisis is something that happens bottom up rather than top down. And so he is a genuinely difficult figure to capture. So the benefit of situating him in COVID, and I said a minute ago, I wanted to record that history on its own terms and for its own sake, but it was also a useful device for me because I could situate the Prime Minister in this crisis. I could sort of press pause, like, you're watching sort of live action replay. I could press pause at a particular moment and I could turn the Prime Minister around in a few different directions and think about who he was through the sum of his actions. And that's the journey the piece takes you on. So
did you have a starting hypothesis? Because you're a much better journo than me, but my starting point would have been Scotty from marketing and looking at, the way, for instance, he'd floated when he was in cabinet the idea of the Muslim wedge, how he had carried the piece of coal into the parliament, how he had been almost a master at building symbols and trying to ascribe meaning to his own personal benefit into them. But you chose, I don't know if it was a conscious choice or it just didn't fit what unfolded, but was there a starting narrative and why wasn't it about the marketing guy?
Well, it's sort of, it is a bit about the marketing guy. Let's just hang on a minute and say that I'm not sure that I am a much better journo than you, Peter. But anyway, setting that to one side.
For 30 years, yeah.
That contention. Let's not argue about that. But no, there is a theme of that, that is an element of who the Prime Minister's about. But I didn't... did I start from I started from a set of perceptions which are formed by watching the Prime Minister at close range, right? I obviously have my own perceptions about who this guy is and what he's about and how he functions. And those perceptions are formed just by the basic journalistic job of bearing witness and also by talking to people about their perceptions of him and how he operates. So I did have perceptions, but genuinely I wanted to take myself on a on a journey. I mean, that's a dreadful cliche, but I wanted to take both myself and the reader on a navigation in order to try and hit some points of truth about the Prime Minister. I didn't, and I wanted it to be, look, there's a profile you could write about Morrison, which is partly the one you suggest, right? Those sort of enduring tropes about Scotty from marketing and obviously whether he did or didn't knife the Prime Minister, whether he did or did not, sort of stack his own pre-selection in order to get in. There's all of that history that is on the public record. And if it had been entirely a profile of the Prime Minister, probably I would have revisited a lot of that stuff, right? But because it was sort of two events and it was a point in time piece, I didn't revisit a lot of the history that people already know. I tried to take the reader behind the scenes about what had happened and why, and put the reader close to the deliberations of the protagonists, but also to work my own brain about who this guy is. And I don't mean, I was going to say I sort of pressed reset on myself and I emptied myself out and then started again. I don't mean that. I don't mean I went into this profile exercise with without a starting point on Morrison. I have a very clear starting point on Morrison, but it's more this thing of just trying through repeated observation at close range and in different circumstances to draw together some observations about the Prime Minister that are true to me, that ring true to me, and that's getting to the essentials of what sort of a politician he is, what motivates him, and where he might end up positioning centre-right politics in Australia, which I think is another work in progress with this Prime Minister that's sort of genuinely interesting.
I think the picture you end up sort of landing on is of someone who is the consummate politician.
Mm.
In a crisis, though, and this is an interesting tension, did the government held, and was it that the politics led to the government holding, or did the politics follow the governing and he actually rose above being a politician?
I think Morrison thinks he rises above being a politician. I think he did on some occasions during this crisis genuinely believe that he rose above the craft of politics. But I don't think somebody who is as profoundly a political animal as the Prime Minister is ever rises above politics. I don't think it's they're capable of doing it. It's a bit like saying, could I rise above being a journalist? Well, I'm a lot more things in my life than a journalist. I'm, and some of the most important things in my life are outside my professional domain. But fundamentally, I am wired for this job. I am. This is something I've spent the most part of my life trying to develop some skills around and instincts for, and Morrison, I'm sure, is exactly the same. So does he suspend politics? No. But what the piece sort of does is takes you into that ultra pragmatism that Morrison has at his core. And that really is what has been on display throughout the crisis. Like this guy literally will do whatever it takes and could do anything. And that, again, is unusual in the Prime Ministers that I've witnessed in my reporting lifetime, who have been sort of slightly more predictable figures in some ways. The limitations of what they could or could not do in a given set of circumstances, whereas this guy really seems to me to have very few boundaries at all and likes that maximum room to move in his own politics. But did he suspend the politics? No, but I think what is interesting, and I sort of lay these crises down side by side in the piece. We've had two federated crises in Australia this year. The first was the bushfires, and the second is the pandemic, obviously. The Prime Minister obviously massively mishandled the first. Just couldn't find a role for himself, couldn't work out how to inject himself in a leadership sense in that first crisis. And the reasons for that are complicated. Start with the fact that the Liberal Party can't engage constructively with climate change and work back, right? But the first crisis was very difficult. I think he learned a lot from that first crisis. And I think he projected what he learned from that first crisis into the second, which brings me back to your point about, did he suspend politics? No, but he worked out that he would not be stranded within the Federation a second time. He wouldn't be the guy standing around impotently on fire grounds trying to force people to shake his hand, or say somewhat testily to journalists, well, I don't hold a hose, mate. He wouldn't be that person again. He would be the person in the centre of the action. And then we have the creation of this governance structure, the National Cabinet. Morrison appoints himself Prime Minister of the Premiers, and they develop this sort of sometimes combative but mainly collaborative framework which pilots Australia through the first phase of the crisis. And that to me shows that the guy learns that he can make a mistake and learn from it and develop it, basically learn some skills that switch it to his advantage. But now, of course, we're in a different phase of the pandemic now, which we can get into when we get into the polling for this week, where the cross currents, it's much more complex what he has to manage now than what it was at the start.
The other interesting thing of the journey to me, and I know we spoke about this as things unfurled, was that when things got really serious, our institutions held up. And before this, we kind of were trying to put Morrison into a Trump sort of, category, the baseball cap, the over, the reality you want to believe. But he didn't actually go down that path. And a lot of nations are now suffering from the fact that their leaders thought that they were beyond the institutions or could wish this problem away. What was it about Morrison that effectively, I guess, brought him into the mainstream of crisis management and created structures that, you could just as easily imagine, Bill Shorten if he'd been Prime Minister, or Albo setting up? Like, what was...
Yeah,
exactly. To me, that our leaders are more mainstream than we think, and even the changes are a little bit sort of more by, emphasis than real design.
Well, it's slightly situational to the extent that there was, a lot of expert advice in the first crisis, the bushfires, that the government obviously ignored, i.e. the climate science, right? Yeah. So, in the pandemic context, possibly the science was less troublesome, at least at the start, for some of the sort of ideologues kind of on the right in Australia and around the world, right? So, he set up, Brendan Murphy says in the piece, like, that's the critical difference here, that they listened to expert advice in the first instance, and that is certainly true. And as you say, Peter, we've in the piece I say, one of Morrison's many experiments, right, in trying to fine-tune his own prime ministership is that, he tried on a Trump suit. he tried it on. He's taken it off and he's put it in the cupboard. I don't think he's thrown the Trump suit out. I think it's in the cupboard. I don't think it's at the tip. I think it's in the cupboard. But I think he's made a judgment that sort of full Trumpism doesn't work in the Australian context, that you can't just be a prototype of that. You have to be your own thing. And also, if I may say, I suppose this is what concerns me, though, about the tipping point that we're at the pandemic at the moment, right? In the opening phase, we did predicate Australia's response on science, on expert evidence, and political leaders dialed down the tribalism and the partisanship, and they focused on trying to get practical outcomes. now as we're sort of drifting into this kind of politics as usual shit fight between the tiers of government, and we get what we've seen over the last couple of days, which is a chorus of people second guessing the epidemiological evidence that Daniel Andrews is relying on for this response, a chorus of people thinking they know better. I think that's a really spectacularly unhelpful direction for the country to go in. Not that I'm saying that you can't query any of that advice. Absolutely, all of that advice needs to be queried. All the responses need to be queried at a high level rather than we just trust that this is exactly the right thing to do. But where we were okay, where other countries weren't, is that the science wasn't respected in other countries. Trump just, made it yet another kind of contribution to a rolling partisan shit fight rather than an actual thing, an actual crisis that needed to be managed. And that's why the pandemic ran away in America. I think it's a bit different in Britain. I just don't know if Boris Johnson was properly focused on it. I don't think it was a matter of let's make this another kind of, stunning blow in the culture war. It's just from this distance, it just looks as though he wasn't sufficiently engaged. He wasn't kind of understanding the potential seriousness of it. But in Australia, look, Scott Morrison and the premiers and others set up structures that, as you say, would have been set up by any government of any stripe and managed the crisis through that lens. I hope we're not backing off that. I really do.
Hey, we're going to look a little bit more into cooperation when we get into the numbers. I had one more question, and we'll take a few from the floor. In the essay, you talk about Morrison explaining his own thought processes, and I can't remember the exact term, but it was like the zone where you just totally trust yourself. Explain how he described that to you.
Flow brain. You mean
flow brain?
Yeah, I think that's the locution. I didn't. Sorry to laugh, but it was
my
really
highlight.
No, it was really just one of those funny things. Because it was sort of at the beginning of the interview, the beginning of the conversation, I was sort of semi-apologising to him for not being able to keep all the facts of the pandemic in my head at any given time, that I just found that really challenging because so much had happened. Maybe I got things out of sequence or whatever. And he said, oh yes, I've got a terrible thing as well. I've got a flow brain, which sounded like a terrible thing. But then when I went and looked it up, apparently it's a cognitive state associated with peak performance where if it's sort of like, I don't know what the expression is, but like you're an Ubermensch or something, that you're in complete command of the situation because you have this perfectly kind of free-flowing cognitive function in your head. So anyway, it's just one of these.
I reckon Trump's got flow brain too, but
I'm not sure he does.
He believes he does.
Yes, and I suppose believing is as close we get to fact. But it's I'm not sure Donald has flow brain. But anyway, I encountered flow brain for the first time in the Prime Minister's office. So and anyway, I've been a bit interested in flow brain ever since, actually.
And is it fair to ask you at the end of the journey of an essay? It's not fair, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Do you like the guy?
It's an interesting question because I sort of it's an occupational hazard, obviously, to like the people you report on, and it's one of those disciplines that I apply quite harshly to myself. I try and ensure that I don't have feelings like that.
Another question, could you imagine liking him? You talk about the Nick Xenophon exchange, which you might like to share with those.
Yes, that's a lovely anecdote, that one. And I'm not avoiding the liking question. I think the honest answer to your question is that even though I give, I hope, a reasonably compelling and coherent sense of who this guy is and what he's about through this piece, there is still much that he conceals. as a prime minister. He has a personal, like some prime ministers have no personal life at all, right? It's all out there. It's all in the public domain. This guy has a life beyond politics, which centres around faith, which we broach in the essay as well, which is sort of visible but off limits. So my honest answer is I don't know enough about him at a deep, meaningful level for me to say I like or dislike him, because there's a lot of Morrison content that is off limits to everyone, right? It's just not relevant from the point of view of the political figure. The Xenophon anecdote's just a lot of fun. Nick told me this several years ago, and I convinced him to tell me this for the piece, just because it seemed to sort of exemplify Morrison's transactional tendencies. There was that weird parliament that Malcolm Turnbull prorogued before the election that Turnbull almost lost. People will forget that now, but they basically prorogued their parliament, brought it back, brought down a budget, and then went to the election. And during that was a very, very strange sitting, with the Governor General coming in to, sort of start the new parliament, which was going to sit for 2 days before the election. It was quite nuts. And so people were milling around, sort of going backwards and forwards for the ceremonial opening between the chambers. And Nick Xenophon spied Morrison, sort of not terribly far away, and he barreled up to him, because obviously Xenophon at that point was a kingmaker in the Senate, a critical crossbench senator. Went over to Morrison, said g'day, went to shake his hand, say, we should have a cuppa sometime. We should just chew the fat, have a cuppa. And Morrison said to him, well, what about? And Nick said, well, just like talking. And the Prime Minister said to him, well, I'm strictly transactional, mate. Like I have zero interest in that, chewing the fat, shooting the breeze conversation. And Nick actually asks the question in the essay, which is the right question to ask, and neither of us know the answer. Nick doesn't and I don't. Whether or not maybe some of the lessons that Morrison was exposed to during this crisis, i.e. that you can just talk to people in order to advance your understanding of things. There doesn't have to be a transaction in it for you. Maybe during this crisis, the Prime Minister might have learned that there's just something in circulating and talking to people even when there's nothing in it for you. I don't know whether he has learned that or not, but it's an interesting question to roll around in your mind.
Hey, we've got a very interesting little discussion going on about flow thinking in the chat. We might get some of those guys and talk towards the end of the discussion, but why don't we just jump into some of the findings from this week's report, and largely because I feel that we've kind of been on the journey with you, and in a way,
Well, this is. I was going to pay tribute really to this group, and to you in particular. You get a shout out in the essay, because we do workshop ideas a lot, you and I. But also in this group, you can, if you read the essay, I think you'll find, folks, that maybe I did some thinking out loud in this group that may have informed where I landed in the end. But anyway, on to the numbers.
And it has been a nice journey, and the fact that we come every fortnight and kick things around with a really engaged group in this town hall is helps me pass the week, but I think it's also helped us build our understanding of what's going on. And we get over time to see, the journey. So sorry, I didn't give Mr. Morrison much time. Approval of Scott Morrison. So again, when your essay was commissioned, he was sitting at 40% approved, 52 disapproved. So there's a little journey that you chronicle. The disapproval at 28 is starting to get back to the realms of mere mortals, but there's still, bipartisan support for his performance.
Yeah, well, he's crawled. Crawled's not right, is it? Clawed, I think, is the word I'm looking for. He has clawed back obviously from the lows of the bushfire, fumbling the bushfire response in full public view to being rewarded by the public for not being tribal, for being competent, for rolling out a broadly competent pandemic response. And he's been sort of on that trajectory really all year since January, sort of coming back from that. We're off the highs, but as you say, the support is still holding up so far.
And a few of the other findings this week sort of reinforce that sense that we're off the highs. Albo's really, the thing that stands out about the opposition is how stable it's been. Like, he's basically where he was in January, isn't he?
Yeah.
Like within 1 point.
Yes, amazing, really. And obviously he would like, presumably he would like those results to be more like Morrison's results. But I think that given how actively oppositions were squeezed out by all the tiers of government during this crisis, states and federal, I think Albanese's done pretty well to keep himself on the map and more or less on the same sort of at the same position as he had at the start of the year. He hasn't gone backwards, even though there's sort of been this outpouring of support for the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's response. It's not like people have then judged Albanese harshly or judged him to be irrelevant or judged him to be not up for it or whatever else. He's just sort of tracking along at more or less the same rate. So anyway, it's quite interesting that.
I'm sure we may have broached this previously, but in the bizarro world that Albo was PM and Morrison was opposition leader, how do you think your man, Scotty, would have played the last 6 months?
Well, I think it would have been, if my thesis is whatever it takes, and broadly my thesis with Morrison is whatever it takes. I don't know. I think he would have made, let's think about this. He would have made some judgments, I think, about timing, that sort of perhaps hoeing into the Prime Minister from the get-go may end up rebounding on you in terms of you look too opportunistic or you look too brutal or you look whatever. So I don't know if he would have come out of the blocks hard right at the beginning, because right at the beginning was such a point of national anxiety that there would have been some risks associated with doing that. But I think by now it'd be on like Donkey Kong, absolutely on like Donkey Kong. I don't think to sort of Tony Abbott extent, but I think Morrison would have looked for every opportunity to, level the playing field between them as combatants.
So apart from all that, I think we're starting to see a narrowing in the value of incumbency as this goes into its next period. In terms of preferred Prime Minister, Morrison under 50% for the first time since April, like 1% below, and still, that's where you'd want to be, but just dropping off. And I think you'll see with the next few slides similar. Government performance responding, total very good, quite good. So it's off 62 to 58. 59 John's put here actually, so there's probably a bit of margin of error or sort of decimal pointage there, but again, first time under 60 that the government performance is judged as good. And we'll also see in the states that New South Wales is under 60, Victoria has gone up a tiny bit, but it's at 50. So those three, the two key states where there's still significant pandemic, I think the other states, it's a given they're travelling well, although notably a 7-point drop in positivity for Queensland government's handling of the outbreak. But it just feels like the kind of good vibes are starting to drop off a bit, Katharine.
Yeah, well, it certainly feels that way in the data, and that's sort of unsurprising because if you're watching closely, and I think a lot of people still are, because there's lots of practical information that they get from their political leaders every day. that's what it feels like. It feels like a souring has happened. It doesn't feel like the whole situation is running wildly off the rails. It doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel like all of a sudden everyone's forgotten how to be competent and how to be collegiate. But this sort of rubbing up against one another that's happening particularly with the Commonwealth and Victoria, where the sort of reasons and fundamentals behind that are obvious. The Prime Minister doesn't want to be blamed for the outbreak in aged care and all of those fatalities. He does not want to be blamed for that. He is wanting Daniel Andrews to be standing next to him, cheek by jowl, if anybody is looking to sort of, make a determination on what went wrong there. Like all that's pretty obvious. I don't think you need to follow politics closely to understand what's going on. And there is this general sense, I think, that people will have got over the last month or so that the National Cabinet is kind of reaching the level, or reaching its kind of as sort of past the high water mark of consensus, if I can put it that way, that now other factors are starting to intrude.
So is it too trite to sort of set it up that we've gone through 6 months where the governing has driven the politics, but now the politics is starting to drive the governing a bit more, and we've got leaders who are at unprecedented high level of support, even with the 56 positive for Andrew, still in a really good zone.
Yeah.
Knowing that if they revert to type, the numbers are going to drop away, aren't they? Isn't this a form of mutually assured destruction that we're sort of looking at the moment?
That's the thing. I think that what we're sort of looking at really is an experiment in how far you can intrude partisan objectives into the day-to-day proposition around this pandemic without completely crashing your approval rating. I think that's what we're looking at. I think that's the experiment that leaders are conducting in full public view. I think they know that if everybody just turned on one another aggressively and there was no nice mask on what's going on, then the public would be brutal about that, I think, in terms of their disappointment about that. So I think they are just experimenting with how much can we just return to politics as usual without it killing us. That's what we're looking at just at the moment.
Hey, I might bring John Remington, our head geek, who's joining us from Melbourne, and a special shout out to all of you who are joining us from Melbourne. Our thoughts are with you all. John, is there any partisan breakdown that's interesting around that Victorian number there of the positive negative? Is it breaking on partisan lines now?
Yes, simply, yeah. This week we've seen around 50% of coalition voters, or those identified with being coalition voter, rating the performance as poor or very poor, and the majority of those are very poor. So that's really starting to get polarised in that sense. Across the other areas, Labour's still getting a bit more support for Andrews in Victoria, with 60% saying very good and quite good.
And what about the partisan break federally? Is that kind of reflecting that as well?
Yes.
Sorry, I threw that one at you.
The short answer is, again, yes. We did mention this in the article, but everything that majority of the people we spoke to was before Sunday afternoon, when Andrews didn't announce the extension to the lockdown. So what will be interesting to see is now how that's changed since that mid-Sunday afternoon announcement.
Yeah. We asked a few questions on the cooperation question too, and I think this is where that notion that there's still the veneer of respectability holding. Obviously, nationally, 64% thinking working well together and 71% working better than at the start of the crisis. Victoria a little bit lower, but still the majority see this thing still working, Katharine.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I think if you a lot of the warfare between the jurisdictions has been carried out in code rather than in direct language. If you're only tuning in every now and again, you may not see the extent of the brawling that's actually going on between the jurisdictions, right? And again, it's like I said a minute ago, I think even if you are an engaged person and you are tuning in all the time, no one's burning the whole structure down. No one has sort of launched a nuclear strike yet on another tier of government, even though it's all been pretty willing. And if I were Daniel Andrews, I would find it pretty frustrating. But there is, what did you say, Indigo? Veneer of respectability? I think that's probably the right way to describe it.
A little bit deeper, areas we think there is good working together, and we've broken these into states. This is a complicated graph, John. So explain. So we've got lower levels of cooperation when it comes to aged care, higher when it comes to controlling the spread across borders. Everything's still above 50% except with the aged care issue though.
Yeah, and we did see that difference in Victoria as well, obviously with the more stricter lockdowns here. Things about tourism and travel within states has a lot less working together, perception of working together well than other states. And yeah, the other one which I've just hid behind there was the aged care facilities. And again, in Victoria, a lot of scrutiny on how that's managed, where the responsibility lies. And we looked into that 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And again, that's been shown in those Victorian results.
We asked the question again, Katharine, and it's hardly moved a button in terms of who's responsible.
No, absolutely. It's a margin of error movement, but I noted in this fortnight, the more people think the feds are responsible than a fortnight ago. It is a margin of error movement. It's noise, but I'm interested in how people apportion blame for that.
Fact-based accountability, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's just interesting.
Yeah. Expectation of change to restrictions. So the question was, what do you expect will happen to restriction levels in your local area over the next 2 months? So good. Victorians obviously have more restrictions to ease, but again, this was before the latest round. I don't know if that number will change. Yeah. It feels to me that both the response to general questions and this question in particular talks to a degree of fatigue that we're now all starting to feel, Victorians more than most, I know. And I think we're entering the next phase where the fatigue will be the defining national mood and how politics play. You know, we've been in crisis, we've been in, you know, a novel lockdown.
Yeah.
There's been a period of hope and opening up. There was a period of frustration, and now we're in a period of fatigue. So I don't know what fatigue does to us.
No, I know it is interesting because it's sort of it's not only what politicians do or don't do, it's also what societies do or don't do that is actually critical to whether or not we manage this thing or whether we don't. You know, part of the success of governments managing this has been a high degree of compliance, obviously, with restrictions and with changes to behaviour. But yeah, fatigue is an interesting thing in terms of how it's like I keep getting, the word in my head is souring, right? It's just there's a general souring, both in perceptions of what governments are doing and also in this sense of being in this thing for the long haul. Now, obviously, if any of these vaccines turn up sort of sometime within the next 12 months, well, that changes the psychology of the thing, and it changes the trajectory of what happens, and it changes how deep the recession will be, right? But if that doesn't happen, if the vaccines are complicated or they take a long time to turn up, if at all, and then we're in this long period of living in a COVID safe way, I mean, it's kind of a misnomer, but you know what I mean, you're living with the virus, you know, the economy's going to be bad, people are going to be very concerned about their material well-being. They're going to be fatigued and exhausted with these restrictions. It's a really difficult period for people. It is. And, you know, people, it's sort of funny, right? Because I was thinking about this a bit on the weekend. Sort of in the bubble of social media, there's a lot of you know, well, venting's the wrong word, but there's a lot of emotion, right? There's a sort of constant outlay of emotion in that ecosystem. And I was just struck by this. This is just a completely random thing, but on the weekend, my neighbours are renovating their house, and they're just stoically going through this renovation that they're doing themselves, right? And they're not particularly attuned to the latest 5-second development on the pandemic or how they might or might not be feeling about it. They're just going on with life. And so on that point about fatigue, I guess it depends on the ratios, right? If there are a bunch of us who are really fatigued to the point where it's counterproductive for our psychology and counterproductive for our well-being, that's really difficult. But then I'm also conscious that there's a whole bunch of folks out there who are stoically, in that wonderfully Australian way, just bloody getting on with it, right? So anyway, we'll keep watching these numbers and see where the national mood is.
Just on fatigue, going back to your man, like,
yes.
What's your prediction of of how he will operate in this next period of fatigue?
Well, there's fatigue for sure. That's one of the cross currents that he's currently sort of dealing with. But it's kind of like a pie chart. There's a number of
personal and national fatigue. Like, how do you manage? Yeah.
Yes, no, that's right. Well, and it's a good question, and yeah, the thing about fatigue is it can lead to frustration, and that can lead to poor decisions. But anyway, so that's a risk. That's obviously a risk. And he's also on the national fatigue front. People will notice if you're tuning in lots, that Morrison always feels it necessary to give a homily about hope. And that's not just him sort of riffing on nothing. That is him understanding that there is this level of fatigue and despair in some quarters of the community starting to build up, and that part of the role of being the Prime Minister is to give people hope, give people tangible things to plan to hold on to, etc. So I think he is sort of accepting responsibility as the national kind of cheer up merchant, or however you want to say it. But it's not only fatigue that he's managing now. There's lots of things crowding on him. There's his own record in the pandemic at a more granular level, whether the Commonwealth is as competent as it says it is or not, aged care being the obvious vulnerability there. There's the dynamic in the government, which is really, really interesting at the moment, which is this sort of tug of war that Morrison's in. At one level, he wants to go on being the Prime Minister of the Premiers, because that's how you manage this crisis. He wants to go on in that structure, that government of 9. But his own people, Liberal and National Party people, are reminding him, as they did forcefully in the last parliamentary sitting fortnight, that he is not the Prime Minister of the Premiers. He is the front man of the firm, which is the Liberal and National parties. And there are particular points of view and values and ways of doing things that the Prime Minister needs to be respectful of. I think that was a very forceful message that was kind of delivered to him over the last couple of sitting weeks. Then we've got the budget period coming up, Peter, which is where Morrison starts to define the recovery in a policy sense. And this guy's not heavy on policy, so this will be his sort of first big policy foray, right? So how is this just a reversion to party like it's 1985?
Well, let's go to the budget. So the Scott Morrison that you've portrayed, he's got two ways he can go. He can go to the Liberal Party playbook, which will be tax cuts, throw a bit of money at industry, wind back the notion of welfare. Or, it was interesting, Sir Linton Crosby's comments this week, that at this stage of the cycle, you're selling hope, you're not selling management anymore. Is there something that is in that, and that's not a progressive person talking about how to play the politics, that's the evil master of the Conservative right, Linton Crosby. does he have a Hail Mary hope play in there, or do you think it's going to be what we're expecting?
Well, no, he is building up this hope narrative, right? Like, definitely Morrison is highly attuned to building a hope narrative. The question about the budget will be whether the actual policy sitting behind the hope narrative aligns with it, or whether it doesn't. And if there's an air gap between the two, if there's an air gap between be hopeful, it's all wonderful, I, Scott Morrison, will lead you from the wilderness, but the policy offering is cut taxes, cut your labour market conditions, chuck a whole lot of money at the gas industry or whomever your favourite boondoggle is in this 5 minutes. People are not going to be thrilled by that, I don't think, because this crisis, this economic crisis that we're in now, if it's protracted, if the vaccine doesn't turn up and turn the tables, requires really innovative thinking about how you sustain a nation during these times. So I don't know if Morrison thinks he can get through the next period by talking about hope a lot, rolling out the Liberal Party playbook circa 1995, with a bit of rally around the flag kind of chucked in for good measure, and that'll be enough, plus incumbency, plus we didn't screw this up, plus give us another term. And look, maybe it is enough, maybe it is, but I think I'm not certain that all translates. But then we've got to, I'm also very conscious that we're getting hints about what the sort of what the policy offering will be. We're getting lots of suggestive hints, but we haven't seen it all yet. And until you see it all, this is just speculation.
And of course, if that's not enough, he has decided to take on the two largest tech companies in the world, at the urging of The Guardian and News Limited and various other strange bedfellows. And we won't go into the policy on that because we've been doing it to death in our tech talks every other Friday. But we did have some other polling. I won't put it up on the screen, but it basically gave the vibe that the majority of voters, particularly, and people probably know the backstory, Facebook has threatened to stop allowing Australians to share news on their platform if the government moves forward with legislation which would require a negotiated settlement in the use of journalistic content by the platforms. That's a mouthful. But the majority of people said, we'll just get our news from somewhere else. So this is interesting on two levels. One is, it's not the sort of fight that you'd be expecting a Conservative leader in the middle of the pandemic to have, but it is also globally significant. I don't know your take on it and what the feeling is in Parliament at the moment. As you know, it's a passion of mine.
Yeah, I do. I know this is absolutely your passion project. It is an interesting fight for him to pick. I think there's been some sober and serious policy work done behind the scenes. Rod Sims has obviously been a really critical player in trying to get some oomph, some intellectual oomph around how you deal with the problem that is the platforms across a whole range of fronts. But I think the reason Morrison is engaged is that I'm sure he understands that platforms are difficult for any political actors. They can be helpful to you. They can also help to kill you. Also, there is the fact that the which you alluded to a minute ago, strange bedfellows, the sort of the traditional media industries in Australia are very aligned behind trying to get a better outcome from the platforms, because obviously we are all in an existential crisis, we who work in the traditional media. News Limited's very much at the front of the queue of this campaign, and News Limited has the ear of the government. I think that there's some pretty interesting relationships there about why the government is so focused on it.
All right, we're almost at the hour. We've had not a single question from the floor. There's been a fantastic
good heavens
discussion going on in the chat, and we haven't really caught him up. But let's give ourselves an early mark. It's 5-2. We've got everyone's homework is to read your essay before we come back in 2 weeks' time. Hannah will put it back in the chat again. What have we got? We're going in the field again in 7 days' time. So we've got a bit of time to see, and that'll probably be looking at the budget in the next cycle, I would have imagined. We've also got an Are You OK Day event on Thursday for anyone that feels like they want to connect and sort of live by the principles of that great organisation. I will be hosting that on Thursday. I don't know, what else are you doing on your, what's the glittering book tour holding up for you now? You've got a few more Zooms?
Yes, I have a number of Zooms over the next little bit talking about it. But if you read it, obviously send me some feedback. It is lovely after you've had a long project that you've been locked away with to see it about in the world and to get some feedback, whether positive or negative. So yeah, let me know what you think.
And it really is it's a great read, and it's a great way to get inside your skin, trying to make sense of what's been such a crazy journey as well. So I think you've done a fantastic job. So thanks for your contribution. And for those that haven't read it, it's a really good way of spending an evening. So on that note, I'll let you get back to the madhouse. Good luck and good wishes, everyone, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks,
Cheers.
everyone. See ya.